slight delay with YouTube. Hello and welcome. My name is Nigel Cudby and I'm acting as your host today. In a short while, I'll hand over to our Speaker Secretary, Nicola Lindsay, who will introduce our speaker, Damien Croft. The presentation will be followed by a Q&A, after which our chair, Roy Henderson, will make some announcements and close the session. First, for those of you who haven't joined us before, I'd like to run through a few domestics. You will notice that you are not visible and your microphone is muted. This is to prevent interruptions from doorbells and phones, etc. We do encourage you to submit questions during this live Zoom presentation. To do this, please locate the toolbar ribbon on your Zoom screen. This will usually be at the top or bottom of your device. Click on the Q&A tab in the toolbar and a panel should appear on your screen. In this panel, type in and submit your question. Please do submit questions to make a lively session at the end. Of course, if you're watching on YouTube, you won't be able to do this. Also in this ribbon is the ability to raise your hand and chat with a panelist if you require any assistance. The webinar will be streamed on our YouTube channel, Elmbridge U3A. It will be available for a limited period for further viewing and for those of you who are unable to register. I'd now like to hand over to Nicola, who will introduce Damien.
Thank you, Nigel, and hello to everyone. In these days when we cannot travel too far, it's great, isn't it, to be able to explore from the comfort of our own living rooms. And like all armchair travellers, we need an expert guide. Damien Croft is such an expert. The owner of Explorer Travel, who specialises in cultural tours, Damien has a master's degree in social anthropology. He's going to tell us today about Armenia, the incredible country. Please, as Nigel has already said, please ask your questions throughout so that I can formulate them together to ask Damien at the end. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Damien to tell you all about Armenia, the incredible country.
Thank you, Nikki, and welcome to all of you. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you about Armenia. And as I've titled my talk, I believe it to be really quite an incredible place. And I'd like to share that passion with you this afternoon. So hoping the talk will last about 50 minutes, and I hope there will be some questions from you at the end. So just to give you a brief overview of Armenia, it's a landlocked country. It has no seashore. It has a population of just under 3 million people, so it's quite a small country. It has 4 international borders. To the north is Georgia, to the west is Turkey, to the south is Iran, and to the east is Azerbaijan. Now, with 2 of those 4 countries, namely with Georgia and with Iran, it has a good relationship, good trading relationship, friendly relationship. But with the other 2, with Turkey, it has a very dubious relationship, and with Azerbaijan, it is pretty much at war. And I'll talk a little bit about this later on in my talk about the origins of how that has come about. So as you can see, the borders with Georgia and Iran are only very small borders. So for almost its entire perimeter, it is entirely locked off from the rest of the world. Added to which there are relatively few direct flights to Armenia. There are a few from Paris, a few from Moscow, but otherwise very, very few. It encompasses a territory of 12,000 square miles. In other words, it's around the same size as Belgium, larger than Wales, but smaller than Scotland, for example. The capital city is Yerevan, and other major cities are Gyumri and Vanadzor up here in the north. It's home to one of the highest freshwater lakes in the world, Lake Sevan, which at an altitude is an altitude of 1,900 meters above sea level. In fact, much of Armenia is at quite a high elevation. Most of it is steppe. You will see photographs of it throughout the talk, and you'll get some idea of the kind of country that it is. There are a few areas which are forested, notably the area to the north of Lake Sevan around Dilijan, which is very often thought of as the equivalent of the Armenian Switzerland, if you like. But otherwise it is mainly pasture land, grazing for sheep and cattle and so forth. So as I said, the capital of Armenia is Yerevan. It has a population of around 1 million people. So in other words, just about a third of the entire country's population live in this city. It's quite a modern city, and in fact, just wandering around, I put this shot in here to give you an idea. The street scenes, the bars and so forth would not be out of place in Paris. It is also one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the whole world. So it also has a very, very long history and archaeology. The spiritual home of the Armenians is Mount Ararat. Now, I put this photo in. This photo is Yerevan, down beneath where I'm standing. And if you look in the background, you can just notice above the haze, a mountain, a snow-capped mountain. That is Mount Ararat, 5,000 meters above sea level. But for the Armenians, there's a great yearning about Ararat because, of course, Ararat is not in Armenia at all. It's actually in Turkey. So what you're looking at here is a mountain that's beyond the borders of Armenia. But nevertheless, in the 1920s, when the architect Alexander Tamanyan was commissioned to redesign the layout of Yerevan, he did so with the idea that everybody would be able to look out from their window and at least sometime would be able to see Mount Ararat. Nowadays, of course, unfortunately, these modern day blocks have grown up, and that's not the case for everybody. But nevertheless, that was his intention. Also, of course, in the height of the summer, it gets lost in the haze. But nevertheless, this photo was taken at 5 o'clock in the morning. If you get up early, look out of your window, there it is, just in the dawn. The Armenian for Armenian, as in the person Armenian, is Hay, that's spelt H-A-Y, and the name for their country is Hayistan. That's what they call Armenia. And it's named that after one of their legendary forefathers who was called Haik. That's not this chap in the photograph here, but incidentally, this was just a photo that I thought gave you some idea about the shepherds in Armenia. But nevertheless, I mention all of that because the the folklore of ancient Armenia has very many similarities with ancient Greek legends and also with the legends of Zoroastrian, for example. We haven't got time to talk about all of that today, but it could make a very interesting talk for some time in the future. Also, still remaining in the distant past of the Armenians, the Armenians can be identified as the Urartians who are mentioned in the Bible. This photograph here is the Erebuni fortress in Yerevan, founded by the Urartian king Argishti in the 8th century BC. Now, also in this fortress is a very interesting tablet, actually. This is a tablet written in the Urartian language, in other words, the Proto-Armenian language, but it is written in cuneiform, Armenian language. We'll come to this later. They don't use cuneiform anymore, of course, but nevertheless, this will show you the parallels with many of the other civilizations of the Middle East, for example, the Assyrians and the Hittites. And I mention this also because if you travel around Eastern Turkey, you will find lots of references to the Urartians, but nobody will ever explain to you that the Urartians of the Bible were actually the Proto-Armenians. So Armenia was part of the Roman Empire under Pompey. It was later part of the Persian Empire under the Sasanians, and it was successively part of the Byzantine Empire. However, in the 9th and 10th centuries AD, the Armenian kingdom was ruled over by the Bagratid dynasty, which was to be one of the most powerful Armenian dynasties, and it laid the foundations for the great Armenian kingdom of Cilicia. This is a map of the ancient Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, and you can see that it stretches from the Mediterranean, down here in the bottom left-hand corner of my screen, right up to the Black Sea, to the east, to modern-day Armenia. This is Lake Sivan that I pointed out on the previous map. So down here in the southwest are the modern-day cities of Adana and Mersin, nowadays in Turkey. This is modern-day Syria, Iraq. You'll notice that there's a large concentration of Armenian cities around this lake, which is Lake Van in Turkey, and it stretches right up, of course, to modern-day Armenia. So this was the Armenian kingdom in the 10th century, 10th, 11th century, I should say, AD. It was assumed into the Ottoman Empire in the 14th century, and there it remained until the breakup of the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the 20th century. So that explains why some of the great Armenian cities are actually today in Turkey. This is a photograph of Ani, which is right on the Turkish-Armenian border. It was the capital of the Bagratid kingdom in the 10th and 11th centuries. It was known as the city of 1,001 churches. And it was also, it stood on the Silk Road, on the road between China and the West. At its height, it was one of the world's largest cities and boasted a population of something like 100,000 people. So a very, very important city indeed. Nowadays, unfortunately, if you go to visit it, I mentioned 1,001 churches. Now there are probably just 3 or 4 remaining there. So here I am. This is still in Ani. You can see one of the churches over on the promontory here. But this river below me here is the river Aras. This is the border between Turkey, where I'm standing, and Armenia, which is on the opposite side of the river. And the Silk Road, once upon a time, crossed this steppe land here, and there was a bridge somewhere down in the river valley, affording people to be able to come up, pass into Asia Minor. Nowadays, however, if you wanted to, there's no bridge across that river anymore. If you wanted to go from here to Armenia, it would take you something like 2 days. You would have to travel up into the north of Turkey, cross over into Georgia, through Georgia, back into Armenia, and down to the other side of the river. So after the First World War, for a short period, between 1918 and 1920, there was actually a fledgling Armenian state. This coincided, as I said, with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, and the Armenian army actually engaged in successful battles with the Turks on this territory, on the other side of the river, on this steppe land over here. But in 1922, Armenia was assumed into the Soviet Union, and there it remained until the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1992. The language spoken in Armenia is Armenian. It is an Indo-European language. So in other words, it belongs to the same family as languages as all the other languages in Europe, and also some of the languages in northern India. But it is completely unique. It's loosely related to languages such as Greek, but otherwise it's incomprehensible to the rest of us. The alphabet, again, is entirely unique. It was invented in 406 AD by an Armenian Mesrop Mashtots, and it has 39 letters. In fact, it's true to say that Mesrop Mashtots just invented the first 36. The last 3 were added later. You'll see, those of you that know Greek, it does have a small resemblance, some of the letters, to Greek. But otherwise it's very much its own script. The only redeeming feature, I think, is that there is no difference between uppercase and lowercase letters, but nevertheless it's extraordinarily difficult to learn the Armenian script. One very interesting thing about it, though, is that the first 9 letters in Old Armenian corresponded to the digits 1 to 9. The second 9 letters corresponded to the numbers 100 to 900. The third set of 9 letters corresponded to the numbers 1000 to 9000, and so on. And in this respect, it was similar to the ancient Greek system of mathematics. Now, I have no idea how you were supposed to do any multiplication or division using such a system, but it must have been possible, obviously. The religion is Christian, and the church is the Armenian Apostolic Church. It's what is known as an autocephalous church, meaning that it appoints its own head and is not subject to an external patriarch, for example, in Rome or Constantinople or Antioch or anywhere else. And in fact, Armenia was the first nation to adopt Christianity back in 301 AD, the very beginning of the 4th century AD. And it was according to tradition, though, that the roots of the church go back even further than that, to the 1st century AD, when 2 of Jesus's apostles, Bartholomew and Judas Thaddeus, came to preach in Armenia between 40 and 60 AD. Bartholomew was martyred. He was flayed alive, and he is the one who is depicted in Christian symbology very often as the skeleton holding a knife in one hand, and his other hand he's holding his his flayed skin. Judas Thaddeus, on the other hand, is usually identified as being the brother of Jesus Christ. And in the Roman Catholic Church, at least, he is known as the patron saint for lost causes. However, the religious leader credited with converting the Armenian nation from paganism to Christianity was Gregory the Illuminator, who was later canonized to Saint Gregory. And it was under the Armenian king Tiridates III who ordered Gregory as a Christian, or he imprisoned him rather, in a pit of snakes, interestingly enough, found in a pit just underneath this building here on the right-hand side of this photograph. And poor old Gregory stayed in that snake pit for 12 years. So bear that in mind during this forthcoming lockdown. If you start to get itchy feet, think of poor old Gregory. He survived, and King Tiridates was so impressed by this ordeal that he converted to Christianity and persuaded the whole of his kingdom to also adopt the religion of Christianity. Nowadays, on the site where Gregory was imprisoned, there is a beautiful monastery, the Kor Virap monastery. And in fact, this was visited, it was on the itinerary of Pope Benedict a few years ago when he came to visit Armenia. If I may just leave Christianity aside for a moment, there's another reason why I wanted to show you this photograph. It's quite an interesting photo. In the background, on the right-hand side, you'll notice some hills. Those are the foothills of Mount Ararat. Mount Ararat is out of shot over on the right-hand side. But beneath that, in the plain here, this is Turkey. And if you look carefully, you can see the minaret of a mosque just here. This here is no man's land. Nobody is allowed to go there at all. And this plain here belongs to Armenia, but the only people who are allowed there are the local farmers who have a permit that can go and tend to their crops. Most other people can't go there. And also, if you look very carefully in this picture, you'll see some little sort of sentry boxes patrolling the border. So this is very much, you do still get a sense of tension in a way along the border between Armenia and Turkey. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a short while. So the modern day center of the Armenian church is a town by the name of Ekmiadzin, which is found to 40 kilometers to the west of Yerevan, and it has a very beautiful church there. This is the interior, this is the dome inside the interior of that church. So this is very much the, if you like, it's the St. Peter's to Armenia, just as, you know, as St. Peter's would be to the Catholic Church. It has that kind of standing to the Armenian people. And hence they make pilgrimages there. They go and light candles. They go and say prayers inside the church. It's beautifully decorated and so forth. Here inside the treasury is a really astonishing artifact. It's all gold, what you're looking at here. This is a gold cross with some precious gems set in it. But the background to this gold cross is actually a piece of wood, which is far more precious than the gold cross itself, because this piece of wood is a fragment of Noah's Ark, which was discovered. You'll remember Noah's Ark came to rest on the top of Mount Ararat. It was discovered. This fragment of wood was brought down to Ekmeiadzin and is kept in the treasury of the cathedral. A large Armenian diaspora throughout the world, most notably in the United States and also in France, but also in Turkey, Syria, Jerusalem, and also in Iran. But the Armenians in Iran arrived particularly in the town of Isfahan in the 17th century. They were brought here by the Shah Abbas. This photograph is the Armenian church in Isfahan. And to all intents and purposes, it looks like an Iranian mosque, except that if you note on the top of the dome, and here, there is the Christian cross. So these Armenians were brought to Isfahan by Shah Abbas, as I was saying, precisely because they were Christians, they were merchants, and they had good relationships with Europe and the West. And they became his merchant class. They were the ones who built up the wealth of Iran in the 17th century. The other place where there is a large Armenian diaspora is in Manchester, which is interesting. And I think that the reason why the Armenians arrived in Manchester was originally because of the textile trade, cotton industry in the 19th century, and so forth. One of the artifacts that is listed in the UNESCO World Heritage is what are known as the kachkars in Armenia. These are essentially tombstones, but they are very, very beautifully carved. And each one is absolutely unique. I mean, when you look at it straight away, you think maybe they're similar or the same, but not at all. They're not molded or copied in any way. Absolutely, each one is unique. And also, you would think that they are symmetrical, but they are never symmetrical, right to left. There's always some little difference one side to another. The cross, this is the Armenian cross. You'll notice that the points of the cross, they have this, if you like, it's like a kind of trefoil. This obviously represents the Trinity, the Holy Trinity. There's a lot of symbology in this cross here. And also the cross itself mirrors or represents possibly the tree of life. There's lots and lots of things that can be said about these kachkar stones. But it also leads me on to the next thing that I want to talk about, which is a difficult subject to broach, but many of you will be familiar with it, and that is the subject of the Armenian genocide that took place in 1915. It's a very delicate subject, but nevertheless, it's something that is still talked about and very much felt in Armenia today. So for the next few minutes, I'll try and give you some kind of background to this very difficult subject as much as I can. Prior to all these events of 1915, there was a large Armenian population in Asia Minor, in what it was those days, of course, the Ottoman Empire. And this was divided between what is now modern east of Turkey and Constantinople. And until this time, under the Ottomans, the Armenians had lived really quite peacefully. And this was due to a system of governance under the Ottomans by the name of millet. Now, millet is spelt M-I-L-L-E-T, allowed each ethnicity to govern themselves and to elect their own rulers, their own leaders. And this worked very, very well indeed. Unfortunately, however, in the case of the Armenians, there was a very large difference between the very wealthy Armenians residing in Constantinople and the often rather downtrodden poor Armenians living in the countryside of modern day Eastern Turkey. And of course, communications in those days weren't what they are now. So there was a very often a disparity between these two sides. Then quite beyond the Armenian cause, really, throughout the 19th century, Christians under the Ottomans, especially in the Balkans, and notably in Greece, of course, were fueled by feelings of nationalisms, and uprisings against the Ottomans became commonplace. And it led, of course, to the foundation of the fledgling Greek state in 1821. However, throughout this time, the Armenians more or less lived passively alongside the Turks in the Ottoman Empire. But nevertheless, with the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the system of millet that had held everything together began to fragment. Furthermore, with the victory of the Russians over the Ottomans in the east of Anatolia in the Russo-Turkic War of 1878, large swathes of eastern Anatolia fell under Russian rule. And this led up to discussions leading to the Treaty of Berlin. And this was the great tragedy for the Armenians because they were not represented in these discussions, purely on the grounds that they did not represent a country. There was no Armenian nation at this stage. Gladstone, at this time, he was lobbied by the Armenian community in Manchester. He was a very high profile supporter of the Armenian cause, but unfortunately Disraeli was unsympathetic. So, I mean, the Armenians could have got a foothold in via Gladstone, but it didn't happen. Then at the same time, Armenians themselves began to harbor feelings of nationalism, and there were some high profile assassinations in Istanbul involving Armenians. This led to tensions and unrests between the Armenian community and the Turks in Istanbul. And around the time of the First World War, this was the time of the rising of what are known as the Young Turks, in particular, the young generals, the future Turkish generals, people like Enver Pasha. They were the ones who began to promote this idea of extinguishing the Armenian, the ethnic Armenians, and gave rise ultimately to what was to become the genocide. The genocide was implemented in two phases. Firstly, there was the wholesale killing of the male population in Eastern Anatolia. And the second phase was the forced deportation of women and children from Eastern Turkey to the Syrian desert, where they were more or less just left to die. There was no food or water for them, clothing or anything else. So it's terrible, but it's estimated that around 1.5 million ethnic Armenians died in this way between 1914 and 1923. Turkey, of course, it still denies this genocide. And one of the problems, of course, is were it to admit it, then it would be liable to compensation and reprisal of land to the Armenians, which of course it doesn't want to do. But let's change tack for the moment, and let's talk about something a little bit more cheerful. Let's talk about Armenian cuisine, which is particularly close to Armenians' hearts. Essentially, it's very close to Mediterranean cuisine. It's not particularly spicy, but there's a prevalence of fresh vegetables. This is a market stall in Yerevan, and you'll notice parsley, coriander, rocket, tarragon, I think that is, some basil, red basil here, dill, onions, radishes, and so forth. So Armenian cuisine is not particularly spicy, but you'll very often be presented with a great big plate of leaves, lovely herbs that you can just mix with different types of cheeses, pulses, and the other things that are important, things like rice. This is us cooking a meal. This is supposed to be a model of Mount Ararat here. This is what the chef is creating here. But you'll notice the walnuts and almonds, also very much a feature of the Armenian cooking. And we mustn't forget the bread, the lavash bread, which is another of the UNESCO intangible artifacts. It's an unleavened bread cooked in a huge clay oven, fired oven, cooked very, very quickly, and then just left to dry. And it can be kept for months, actually, in this state. Just you buy it in the market just like this, and then spray on a little bit of water, heat it up, and it's good as fresh to eat. We should also mention Armenian wine, which is very much in the ascendancy. Some very, very good Armenian wines nowadays are being produced. And of course, we mustn't forget that Armenia, along with Georgia, vies to be the birthplace of wine making. Where we are in this cave here, in this photograph, archaeologists have uncovered these amphora. This was a winery, and it dates back 6,000 years. So it's very probable, actually, that this could well have been one of the very first wine cellars in the world, actually. Apart from wine, we should also mention Armenian brandy, very famous throughout the Soviet Union, but also in France, for example. The famous Armenian brandy, the name is Ararat, and this was the brandy that was favored by Winston Churchill. In fact, the story goes that he asked Stalin to send him a monthly consignment of this brandy. And all was going well until after a few months, he started to think that perhaps this brandy that he was receiving was not to the same quality as it had been once. He asked Stalin to investigate, and Stalin asked his supplier. His supplier admitted that he had started to ship inferior quality brandy, and he was immediately banished to one of the gulags. At which point Churchill intervened and asked for this poor brandy merchant to be brought back, to be given his freedom, on the condition, of course, that he continued to ship only the most superior quality brandy. So it had its own connoisseurs here in the United Kingdom as well. Finally, just a little bit about Armenian culture and sport. Armenian weddings are great events, just as they are throughout Turkey, the Balkans, Greece, and so on, Italy. Huge events, people dressing up, and festivities and so forth. Armenian carpet making is particularly famous. Here we are in an Armenian carpet factory. These women here are actually, they're not making carpets, they are mending antique carpets. On the wall behind them are different wools dyed by, they're all organic dyes, these. This is a very important part of the process. It's also worth saying something about sport. The Armenian national sport, and this says a lot about the whole nation, I think, is chess. And chess is a compulsory subject taught in school in Armenia. It's also worth saying something, I think, about Armenian music. The number of famous Armenian composers, for example, throughout history. The most famous one, I think, was Aram Khachaturian. We should remind ourselves that the French singer Charles Aznavour was of Armenian descent, as is the American singer Cher. The Armenian folk instrument is this little creature here, and it's known as the duduk. It's a double reed instrument, so it's a relative of the oboe, but the reed is much larger, it's much wider than an oboe reed. So the sound it's a very mellifluous, haunting and beautiful sound. So if I may, I'd just like to play you a fragment of this duduk player. I think you'll agree that's a very plaintive and haunting sound, very unusual, ethereal, otherworldly sound. The other composer that we ought to mention is Komitas. He is the Armenian equivalent, if you like, of Bela Bartok or Vaughan Williams. He collected many of the Armenian folk songs and wrote them down. He had a very tragic end, unfortunately. He lived in Constantinople. He was arrested in 1915. He witnessed much of the genocide. He managed to escape to France, but spent many of the last years of his life living in an asylum, a psychiatric asylum, unfortunately, in Paris. But nevertheless, some beautiful compositions by Komitas if you want to go and look them out. Just finally, the last 5 minutes of my talk, I'd like to say something about the present conflict in the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, since it's been very much in the news of late. It's a very difficult subject to talk about, but if I can give you some background, I will try. So, as I said at the beginning of my talk, Armenia is bordered by 4 countries: Georgia, Iran, Turkey, and Azerbaijan. But it's a bit more complicated than that. If you look down here to the southwest of Armenia, this area here is a territory known as the Republic of Nakhchivan. Now, this is in an Azeri-speaking territory, and it belongs to Azerbaijan. Now, so obviously there is no corridor between Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan. There's no corridor through Armenia. If you want to get from Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan, the only way of doing so is to come south from Azerbaijan through Iran and into Nakhchivan that way. There is actually a small land border, shared land border with Turkey here, which does allow some traffic through. And there are also, there is an air corridor between Nakhchivan and Istanbul. But not only that, if you look a little bit closer at the map, if you look at these little islands here, so we've got little islands, these are pieces of Azerbaijan actually within inside Armenia. There's another one down here, if you notice. But there's also an island of Armenia inside Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, of course, they're Muslim. They speak Azeri, which is it's very close actually to Turkish. It's very similar to Turkish. The two can actually understand each other, Azeris and Turks. And of course, it's quite, you can quite see why that Turkey would really love to build a road to join Azerbaijan and Turkey together. So that's one of the sources of the conflict. But not only that, I don't know if you've noticed, this is a Google map, but what Google does is the place names of the map are written in the language of that country. So for example, place names in Turkey are written in Turkish, place names in Georgian are written in Georgian, place names in Iran are written in Farsi, and in Armenia in Armenian, and in Azerbaijan in Azeri. This is Azeri here. But what you'll notice is that Nagorno-Karabakh doesn't feature on this map. That's because it is not internationally recognized. It is a disputed territory, and it is recognized only by Armenia. It is known to Armenians as the Republic of Artsakh, and it is this area here, more or less the area you can see with the green. It's a very, Nagorno-Karabakh is a very green forested area. And the only way of getting to Nagorno-Karabakh is from Armenia along this road here. It is a territory, they are ethnically Armenian in the sense that the language that they speak is Armenian, and they are also Christian. And yet they find themselves in the country of Azerbaijan. So how did this come about? Well, in essence, the root of the problem goes back to the 1920s and the inception of the Soviet Union, the so-called Sovietization of the Caucasus. These were decisions made by the Caucasian Bureau, especially under Joseph Stalin. And at the time, the people of Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh lobbied to be part of Armenia, but instead Stalin apportioned them to the Soviet of Azerbaijan. And he did a very similar kind of thing with South Ossetia in Georgia and also Abkhazia. And it was a very deliberate ploy on Stalin's behalf, because he knew that by dividing these people up, there would be no way that they would ever be able to join together. It was very much a case of divide and rule. So during the Soviet era, up until 1988, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh more or less lived with their lot and just got on with life. But in 1988, with the beginning of the breakup of the Soviet Union, they demonstrated in Stepanakert, which is this city here, to reunite and join Armenia. There were reprisals from the Azerbaijan military, and this was the beginning of battles, which eventually turned into a war, the War of Nagorno-Karabakh, which smoldered on up until 1994, since which time there has been a ceasefire, largely a ceasefire. There has been skirmishes, particularly along this border here, this area here. But unfortunately, a few weeks ago in September of this year, the conflict reared its head again. And as you're all too aware, in recent weeks, it is broken out into open warfare between the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan. As of today, there is notionally a ceasefire holding. Let us just hope that it holds for longer, because it's a very, very difficult conflict to see that there will ever be, it's very difficult to see where the resolution might lie, to be honest, and not least because two of the big countries involved in the negotiations are Turkey, who, as I said, would be very keen to see the end of Armenia, or at least drill a hole through Armenia to get to Azerbaijan, and Russia, who is selling arms to both Azerbaijan and to Armenia. So they have no interest at all in this conflict coming to an end. So very sticky situation. We only hope, especially throughout the winter, that the ceasefire holds. So what I think is incredible, really, is that Armenia squashed in on all sides, that it actually continues to exist as a country. And I think the testament to that is the fortitude of the Armenian people themselves. And I think there is no better expression for that than in the music of the Armenian people. And I'd like to finish off my talk with a very short clip. It's a video clip of some singing in a monastery in Armenia. It's a very dark video. That's because there's no lights in the monastery at all. It's completely pitch black inside, but nevertheless, it's very soulful and it's very moving. And I think it is entirely representative of the fortitude of the Armenian people. So with this, I would like to just finish off my talkie.
Well, that was fantastic. What a wonderful piece of music to finish off. That's a very clear and comprehensive little journey around Armenia. So thank you very much for that, Damien. I mentioned it's clear and comprehensive, but we do have some questions. Elaine has said that she recognises as a complex language background today. She worked when she visited in 2010 with teachers who were bilingual Russian-Armenia. But the school in Diligen was introducing more English and looking towards Europe and the USA. One stream at the school was still bilingual with Russian and still looking towards Russia, but the other stream was using some English too. And so really, Elaine is asking, has that changed since then? Are we and Europe generally providing more support?
That's a very interesting question, actually. No, I don't think it has changed. If anything, it has developed even further. And it's a very good observation, actually, because as you travel around Armenia, you'll find that a lot of the elder generation do speak Russian. That's because, of course, they had to. But the younger generation, and this is not just the school in Diligen, it's all the way through Armenia, they are tending to learn English, and English is very much the language of the younger generation in Armenia. The other thing that's to be said about that is that there are actually two dialects of Armenian. There is Eastern Armenian and Western Armenian. Eastern Armenian is the dialect that's spoken in Armenia itself, and Western Armenian is the dialect that is spoken through the Armenian diaspora, in particular in the United States. And one of the things that is happening, and has happened since 2010, and it's continuing all the time, is that these young third generation, second generation Armenians from the United States who speak Western Armenian are coming to Armenia to, if you like, brush up their Armenian, to learn Eastern Armenian. But at the same time, of course, there is this interchange between English and Armenian. So absolutely, yes, this process is continuing very much indeed. And also, because the other thing to be said with that is that it is the Armenian diaspora very much which is providing the economic support these days for Armenia. So hand in hand with the language is also as I say, some sort of economic support as well. Yeah. So very good question. Thank you for asking that.
On a day when we're all thinking about politics across the other side of the pond, what's the political system like in Armenia?
Yes, well, of course they have their own government now. The Armenian leader, prime minister, is a guy called Pashinyan, and he was voted in a couple of years ago. Prior to that, he'd been something of a revolutionary, and he was voted in very much as a. I mean, one of the criticisms that has been levied at Armenian politics throughout the course of the years is criticism of cronyism. I mean, there were incidents of politicians taking revolvers and so on into parliament. I think there was even a shooting or something a few years ago. But anyway, as I say, Pashinyan was voted in a couple of years ago, and he's brought in a great breath of fresh air to Armenian politics. And I think amongst the young people, there is a feeling, what I think is most important is that the young people are interested in politics again, whereas, 10, 15 years ago or so, they weren't, because there was no alternative to it. So hopefully a very positive outlook for Armenia on that sense, I would think.
Oh. So just thinking about the population generally, are many young people, do they stay in Armenia or do they travel to different countries?
Well, it's very difficult for them to travel for two reasons mainly. Primarily economically, it's very expensive for them to travel. But the other reason, of course, is the corollary of what I was mentioning before. There just aren't any flights out, or very few, and what flights there are very expensive. So as a result, you don't get many Armenian tourists traveling around Europe. And of course, this is one of the problems, because not having the opportunity to travel abroad, it's obviously much harder for young Armenians to learn the language, to develop all kinds of skills and so forth. Yes, it's a problem for them, and it's very difficult, undoubtedly.
On a slightly flippant note, the duduk, the wonderful duduk, is that played elsewhere or is it just Armenia?
Well, yes. Interesting. Yes, it is played elsewhere. Interestingly, it's played in Turkey. It is a very diffuse folk instrument in Eastern Turkey. It's interesting, actually, because in the Turkish language, the word duduk just means whistle. But despite that, the Turks have the same instrument, and it is known as a may in Turkish. But it's a very good example, I think, of a tradition that Turks and Armenians share, but they refuse to recognize that actually it's the same tradition. It's the same, they've got the same instrument. Yeah.
Rivalry even there. So a penultimate question was asked by 3 people. So Marlene, Nigel and Roy, I'll phrase it in slightly different ways, but essentially we're saying, asking really how they fare economically. What's the economy based on?
Yes, it doesn't fare very well, I think it's true to say. And when Armenia was part of the Soviet Union, there were huge copper mines and copper smelting factories and so forth. I mean, in fact, as you travel through Armenia, particularly the northern part of Armenia, dare I say it, one of the things you see are the vestiges of these awful factories, which have never really ever been replaced. And the real problem for Armenia, the economic problem for Armenia, is even if it were to produce something, how on earth would it export them? Because the lines of communication just don't exist. I mean, it has a border with Iran, but Iran can't export anything to the rest of the world. So the only means of exporting is via Georgia. So they cling on to this route very much indeed. And it's one of the reasons, I think, why in some ways the great export of Armenia is their intellectual capacity, their cultural capacity. That's why they export great musicians, and they're very well known for things like chess and so on and so forth, because they don't have any, there's no factories, they don't produce anything at all. And yes, it's a huge problem. But as I say, thankfully, they have the Armenian diaspora, particularly in the United States and in France, who is helping them. And one of the things that's happened over the last few years, some wealthy Armenians from America have been investing in Armenia. They've created things like hotel chains. They've built some very nice hotels, for example, in Armenia, with the hope that one day tourism might well come to the rescue of Armenian economy. Yeah.
Yeah, well, having been there, I'd certainly recommend it for people to go.
Absolutely, yes.
So finally, the last, it's more of a comment really than a question. So Elaine again says, very interesting talk, lots of great photographs with wonderful views.
Thank you.
And she mentions that her best picture of Mount Ararat was from the airport departure lounge. And like you, observes that Yerevan has a cafe culture. She especially liked the weekend markets, pictures and bric-a-brac, and watching the old men playing chess.
Absolutely, absolutely. Oh, fantastic! Thank you. Well, I'm glad you've enjoyed it, and it's been a real pleasure to speak to you.
And I'll hand over now to Roy.
Okay, well, hello again, and I hope you've all enjoyed this really fascinating talk about a country most of us have heard of, but know very little about. It's really a shame that often the only time we hear about places like Armenia is when they're involved in some vicious local conflict, and then all we see on the news are shattered buildings and people's lives. So many thanks to Damien for opening our eyes to Armenia's culture, history, geography, and cuisine, and indeed wonderful music. Absolutely beautiful music. Anyway, hopefully when the conflict is over and we can travel again, we might be able to visit and see for ourselves. Let's hope so anyway, and thank you very much, Damien, that was brilliant. So just quickly on with the announcements. You'll all know that we're back in lockdown for at least a month, not quite as long as Gregory and his snake pit, but still very unwelcome. So consequently, Elmby's UCA first tentative steps towards normality are back on hold, I'm afraid. We will, of course, be continuing with our various online activities listed on the website and in our email bulletins, but the tight restrictions on personal contacts mean that outdoor meetings are no longer, even outdoor meetings are no longer possible. So who knows what will happen next? We can only wait and see, and we'll certainly keep you informed of any changes that we hear about. So during this time, Elmby's U3A remains open for business, unlike some other U3As, and we are still advertising locally for new members, and people are coming forward, I'm glad to say. We're also very grateful to our existing members who have renewed their membership so quickly. This is really helpful because we're trying to plan our post-COVID future, and it's very useful to know how many members we're going to have to cater for. So if you haven't yet renewed for 2021, please look out the renewal form sent to you with your newsletter. It's got all the information you need, quick and easy process. And as I said last time, EU3A is still very good value, only £10 a year's membership. So next thing you do, have a look at that form and get it sorted out. Normally we only have one of these membership webinars a month, but this time it's different. Next Wednesday, 11th November, we're holding a special scam awareness webinar for EU3A members with advice on how to avoid being taken in by the numerous predators who are prowling the internet and telephone services for a chance to steal your money. You worked hard for it, so don't let them take it from you. Some scams are pretty obvious and well known, but the people behind them are ruthless and incredibly clever. And they're always looking for new ways of exploiting your fears and taking your money. We've got an excellent speaker, Sally Schofield. She's a banker and acknowledged expert in the field, and her advice is well worth listening to. So please tune in and watch her talk, which starts at the usual time of 2 p.m. on Wednesday, 11th of November. Nicola will send you a link a few days beforehand, so look out for that and join in. You may find it very helpful. And then on Wednesday, 2nd December, we're entering into the Christmas spirit with Fool's Gold, an acoustic live music Christmas show by two accomplished musicians, Carol and Steve Robson. And they've entertained audiences all over the UK with their songs, stories, and instrumental skills. Christmas 2020 is going to be a strange and different experience for all of us, but why not tune in and get started early? But it's not at the usual time, take note. The live performance begins at 10:30 a.m., just right for your morning coffee. So sit down, tune in, relax, and be entertained. Finally, inconvenient though it may be, please remember why we are in lockdown. There's something nasty out there. Take the best of you can find, do what you can, be careful.